Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Tico, and I help run events here at the Strand. Before we launch into discussion of Sarah Krasnostein's new book, The Believer, Encounters with the Beginning, End, and Our Place in the Middle, I'd like to share a little bit of history about the Strand. The Strand was founded in 1927 by Benjamin Bass on 4th Avenue's Brook Row, stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Brook Row gradually dwindled from 48 bookstores until after 94 years, the Strand is the sole survivor, now run by third-generation owner Nancy Bass-Whiten. We want to thank all of you for your support. Without our loyal community of book lovers and authors, such as Sarah Krasnostein and Sarah Sentilles, we wouldn't be here today. We are thrilled to have Sarah Krasnostein with us for the launch of her new book, The Believer, Encounters with the Beginning, End, and Our Place in the Middle. Sarah is a writer and lawyer with a doctorate in criminal law. Born in Charlottesville, Virginia, she divided time between Melbourne and New York. Sarah's first book, The Trauma Cleaner, won Australia's Victorian Prize for Literature. Joining Sarah in conversation is Sarah Sentilles. Sarah Sentilles is the author of Stranger Care, Draw Your Weapons, which won the 2018 PEN Award for Creative Nonfiction, Breaking Up with God, A Church of Her Own, and Taught by America. A graduate of Yale University and Harvard Divinity School, she lives in Idaho's Wood River Valley. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Sarah Krasnostein and Sarah Sentilles to the stage.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi, Sarah.
This is such a beautiful book, this book, The Believer. It is just gorgeous in every way. I had the luxury of getting to read it twice. I read it for the second time over this weekend, and it was even more beautiful, more profound, more moving. I cried more. So thank you for writing it, and thank you for showing what generosity looks like on the page. And why don't we start with a reading?
Thank you. Thank you for the very kind words, which mean the world to me. I have decided without consulting you first that we should do the prologue instead of the bit that's further in, because I think that's more welcoming for people that haven't read it twice. No pressure, everyone else. And before I do read it, can I just say I am a Strand stan from back in the day, and I have my Strand little altar here, and I'm so excited to be here, if only virtually. I'm there in my heart. So with no further ado, reading from the prologue. Okay. This book is about ghosts and gods and flying saucers, certainty in the absence of knowledge, how the stories we tell ourselves to deal with the distance between the world as it is and as we'd like it to be can stunt us or save us. The word distance comes from the Latin distantia, which means standing apart. We have invented numerous ways of measuring this apartness. There's Euclidean distance, the shortest path between 2 points, assuming the absence of obstacles. Manhattan distance, the number of blocks a taxi must travel to reach a destination in New York City, assuming, delusionally, the absence of obstacles. Canberra distance, a less colorful metric for the distance between pairs of points in a vector space. And Chebyshev distance, which concerns itself with the moves of a king on a chessboard. We have painstakingly devised metrics for the distance between notes in a chord, strings of computing code, certain and possible events, periods of time, points in outer space, and the magnitudes of removal between ourselves and the actor Kevin Bacon. Psychological distance is a way of measuring the cognitive separation between ourselves and other people, events, or times. It is the felt experience that something or someone is close to or far away from us here and now, which is to say that there is not a direct relationship between psychological distance and objective distance. Something far away in space and time can feel closer than something right beside us, and vice versa. Psychological distance is our superpower and our Achilles heel, a way of falling or flying. Before it descended into dailiness, the phrase social distancing would remind me of something I learned years ago about perspective in space while reclined between my husband and our eldest child under the domed roof of a planetarium. Wherever plunked down in the vastness of the cosmos, the narration said, the viewer will perceive themselves to be at the center, and this means the opposite of how it feels. There is no center. The universe is more immense than we can possibly conceive, and it is moving away from us all the time. You're about to read 6 different stories, 6 different notes in the human song of longing for the unattainable. Their combination is the 7th note. I didn't set out to find these stories. I stumbled on the first one, a choir in a train station, as absurd as it was beautiful, and this led me to the next, and so on. But of course, while meetings can be accidental, curiosity is not. Until we make the unconscious conscious, said Carl Jung, it will direct our lives and we'll call it fate. In each case, I needed to understand them, these people I found unfathomable, holding fast to faith and ideas that went against the grain of more accepted realities. It may be accurate to say that I needed to get closer to something, someone that felt very far away, that I believed maybe I could. One of the lies writers tell themselves is that all things should be understood.
That's beautiful. I'm glad you read the prologue because I was reviewing the section I asked you to read, and it might be the saddest, most difficult section in the book, but that's what I'm always drawn to, and it's beautiful. So let's talk. Appears on a plane. There is someone who's in prison for decades, who has been in prison for decades for killing her abusive husband. So how did you get interested in these stories, and what for you draws them all together?
Right. So I, as I mentioned in the prologue, I literally stumbled across the first one, which was this Mennonite choir, and it was in the South Bronx in the subway station. And there was something there that I couldn't have articulated at the beginning, and indeed through the subsequent months that I spent immersed with a few of those families, learning about how the world looked through their eyes. I knew that I didn't want to write a standalone story because I had the glory or the tragedy of also having another story that I was covering at the same time, which was slowly learning Lynn's story in the homeless shelter that I met her on a separate project. And what struck me at that early stage was that the color, the texture, the sound of Lynn's story, I met her 4 months after she was released from prison, where she had been for 35 years for murdering her abusive husband, was making the same sound as what these Mennonites were telling me about a very retributive, transactional conception of God. And I couldn't have told you what it was at that point, but I knew I wanted to explore why these two stories felt the same. What were the commonalities between them? Because of the Mennonites, they led me to the Creation Museum in Kentucky. They had their corporate retreat there the previous years. They have an email filtering business, making the internet a safer place to be in their framework. More godly place to be. And so I was struck by what they were telling me. And then I hopped on and I read about the Creation Museum, which was, accredited PhD scientists from, normal accredited colleges and universities who were making this argument that the world is 6,000 years old because it says so in the Bible. And again, these people that were holding these contradictory beliefs simultaneously, that struck me. And the more I read about what they were arguing, and then sat and spoke with them, again, that was making the same sound. It felt similar. The emotional understory was, I thought, similar to these other stories that I was hearing. And so over the next 4 years, as I discovered other people through these themes that were revealing themselves in those foundational stories, I was confronted with the task of trying to integrate these in a way that would welcome the reader into that same kind of sound that I was hearing.
It's really interesting that you use the word sound. I mean, because you open with that choir singing, and I think it was actually the writer Nick Flynn who taught me to pay attention to things that seem different but feel connected in our minds or in our hearts or our bodies, like something that we're drawn to. We might be writing about the criminal justice system, but we're drawn to whales singing. And he was always just like, well, just write about that. Just keep writing and trusting your brain that it's showing you more about, or there's something to be revealed that can't be revealed unless you put those things together. And I think your book shows that.
Oh, that's very good. But that's exactly it. And I'm sure maybe you've had this as well. Maybe Nick has had this as well, where initially those things feel a little annoying. They feel like a little distracting from the story or what you think is the story or what you set out to try to accumulate or focus on. And, when you're researching, factual writing, you can't chase every rabbit down every hole, and you have to kind of maintain some focus, but you have to stay sufficiently open to allow for those, synchronicities between the exterior world and this interior world of your project. And so those things that come up at first, those sounds, they feel a little distracting, a little annoying, like they're taking your focus away. And my experience so far is that that's the book, that's the story, the thing that you didn't know you were getting. And so he's absolutely right, that openness is everything.
I think that's the medicine for the state of the world that we live in, right? You're writing about all these people who are in these very discrete bubbles, and we're really trained to keep things apart. We're trained to keep things apart rather than making these connections. And it's a political radical act to make those connections among things that we are supposed to not think about together. So I think that's part of the power.
Yeah, 100%. I was just going to say, like, God forbid I don't mention the which I brought up to you before, my favorite podcast, This Jungian Life. But they were Jungian therapists just kicking around ideas. But they said the other day, one of them said, we're not built for introspection. We are built to run away from a lion. And so, when we take that time to kind of pause and make these connections, it's a beautiful thing. I mean, the collapsing of boundaries, it's also a very frightening thing. We lose the certainty, but anyway, yeah.
That's perfectly said. Can you talk a little bit about the structure of the book? I don't know why I hadn't noticed it the first time, that below, above, and here. I think it's really interesting. And can you just talk about your decision making around that?
Sure. So one of the commonalities, like the words that would accompany the sound I was hearing, was this notion of it was fear generally, specifically of death. And so the creationists, for instance, their whole framework really came down to the fact that if the Bible wasn't literally true, then death didn't exist as a punishment for sin. It existed, they don't know why, for reasons that have to do with injustice or chaos, or they couldn't explain it. And so they needed death to make sense. That was something that I was hearing again with the Mennonites, who believed that our current existence was just a prelude to a more glorious one in a life to come. The death doula, Flynn, everyone had a story that tried to link, the world as it is, with all of the crappy parts, death being one of them, ineluctably, and the world that we so wished it would be, which was, fairer, made more sense, and kind of more controllable. And the stories, to varying extents in different ways, try to make that connection. So the structural framework of the book really mirrors that content, or that idea that, we're here now, and then we have, below, everything we don't know, everything that we submerge in the shadows, that we're fearful of, what's to come, or literal death buried underground. Above, this loftiness, this world that we can't explain, the great mystery, and also our higher impulses, when we use that over dependence on our cognitive capacities and our desire for sense making, when we use it to connect and achieve these higher goals, that's all of that sits above. And then in the middle, here we are, that's the only certainty. We're here now. What do we do with these two things? How do we reconcile these two extremes into a meaningful life?
That's beautiful. I mean, the writing is so beautiful in this. And one of the commonalities through all the stories is this like pain. People are in pain, they're suffering, and they're often willing to accept like even more painful stories about why they're in pain in order to give that suffering meaning. But you write this line, we are built to share each other's pain. And I feel like that is really the belief that forms the foundation of your writing practice, both in Trauma Cleaner and in this beautiful book. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that. What does that mean? We're built to share each other's pain.
So, like, God forbid I write a book that isn't informed by or refer to the research of Breanne Brown. But her work around shame, so far, so I've got a perfect hit rate, but her work around shame had enormous effect on me. And also imperfection, which is, our shame around not being good enough, not being perfect enough. Ultimately, all of our kind of self-justifications for a sense of not belonging. And her kind of a guiding light in everything that she writes is that our vulnerability is the source of all true connection. And when we are honest about that, when we can sit in that, that's where the connections occur.
Mhm.
Martin Buber, 100 years ago, was writing about those true meetings, that connection of ourselves. And when we can see a different but equal I in the other, that connection, when it can be made, is where he located God, the source of all holiness. That was his understanding of God. So, we can't wish away or rationalize away in these very perfect or well-argued, seemingly coherent and persuasive, perfect stories, those ineluctably crappy parts of life. Again, the technical term, I don't know if that's what it is, but sickness, death, injustice, uncertainty. We can't get rid of them. We can't eliminate them, but we can ameliorate them if we sit in that discomfort together. Or not. It's a huge ask. We don't deal with discomfort. We're wired to run away from it. We fight and we flee up into our heads, and we try to, bargain with reality and overuse that sense-making function. But if we just put it down and we sat there together, that connection and community might short circuit all of these kind of pathological responses that we try to apply to our personal problems and our collective problems. So now I've forgotten the question, and that's probably a long way of not answering it.
We're built to share each other's pain.
There we go.
Yeah. You did it. You answered it perfectly. And I have to say, as an aside, I love the writing about Martin Buber. I love Martin Buber so much. I Am Thou, I've probably read maybe 100 times. I've taught it. I love that book. And I did not know that his mother abandoned him.
Yes.
I did not know that. And it just makes so much sense now.
Yes.
His writing makes more sense to me.
What do we do with the wounds? How can we use them to, heal ourselves and heal each other?
And the longing for the other, that's always outside of our grasp in some ways. You talked about it a little bit, like when you talked about Breanne Brown, but this idea of the messiness of life, I think you've told me before that you'd like to capture the messiness of life on the page. So can you talk a little bit about what does that mean, like as a writer? How do you do that as a writer? How do you show messiness? How do you show people in their full humanity and complicatedness? Complexity would be the word I was looking for.
Right. So again, like, God forbid I don't mention Janet Malcolm. I will butcher it, no doubt, but she has a wonderful line in one of her books that I can't remember now, because whenever I need to speak about books, it's like I've never read one. But she says, the different, that a certain kind of neatness is the neatness of fiction. And there is a certain messiness, a certain kind of recognizable incoherence or lack of sense that comes with factual writing. And that can sometimes, well, hopefully, and I'm sure as she must have believed, or she wouldn't have written so many books, that it's its own form of sense making, allowing, space for the consistency that's associated with character and human behavior, but also the realistic ability to surprise and disappoint and be hypocritical and all of the rest. That mess is part of realistic human characters. It's part of realistic human action. And it is just part and parcel when you're writing factually about the world. And so because I'm a craft nerd, I really do try with most things that I do in longer form to have a form that mirrors or supports in some way the content. And here, what I wanted was to structure the book in a way that mirrored that content of what would it look like if we could have a house of unlike things, where we could all sit together and didn't need to be right and didn't need to, justify ourselves, didn't need to, prove someone else wrong, but all of us and our differences and our messiness could sit side by side. What would that look like? And at the same time, provide enough countering details that the reader might choose not to come along with me in my take on what all these stories meant, but could take here and there and form whatever meanings would help them, would inspire them. And in that sense, we would perhaps be doing the work of living, which is what we take meaning from our external circumstances in the world. And we see that, Jungian synchronicity between the exterior world and our interior life. We take what we need and what gives us strength. And hopefully that story will have room for everyone. It won't be one that locks us into a constricted way of being. Or not.
Yeah, I love that House of Unlike Things. It's such a beautiful thing. I was just looking at the news and thinking about the war in Ukraine, and there's a lot of like racist discourse going on in the news about these aren't normal refugees, these are white refugees, these are Europeans, these aren't Syrians, these are blonde people, and it's just like sickening. I think one of the powerful antidotes in your book is this House of Unlike Things, where you can hold contradictory ideas at once and find connection across difference. I think empathy often fails us because we have to see likeness in order to connect with someone, which is what people are doing in Ukraine, which is great. But we don't seem to have a problem with connecting with people who look like us or talk like us or act like us. We have a problem connecting across the abyss of difference formed by racism or sexism or all the other kinds of oppression that goes on. And I think that's one of the things that your book destabilizes, which is, when I have feelings like I love the death doula and I'm really uncomfortable with this other character, by the fact that you put them together, I have to ask myself, what am I getting wrong? What am I missing? What does my discomfort reveal about me? And I think that's a real political act.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you.
That's not really a question. So I have another question. I have a question for you.
I was hoping that would that's right. Like there's nothing that I can add to that. I mean, but I also think like it was reminding me, there was one of the early principles of Gestalt psychology was, our perceptual shorthand that we use, not just for our emotional life and our relational life, but in understanding the world around us. And it's that example of like that black vase on a white background, and what do you see first? The faces or the vase, and we have this sorting reflex. We're built for certainty over accuracy, and when we group things by easy proximity or simple similarity, we do back ourselves into this highly antagonistic, very tribal, ultimately self-defeating. I mean, if you didn't want to even make the case for empathy, you could say this is, when you back your own invulnerability, your brand's pretty vulnerable. So, how can we look again? How can we reimagine our relationship to each other and the world? And
how can we look again is a really powerful question. And my mentor in graduate school was a Mennonite, actually, ironically, maybe given the Mennonites that you write about, but his name is Gordon Kaufman. He's died since then, but he always said the most ethical thing you can say is I might be wrong. And I thought about his words over your whole book, and he always said that doesn't mean you can't stake your own life on your belief, but it means you can't kill another person over it. Which I think is, I just felt that in the pages of your book. So
that's
let's
so
talk
powerful.
A bit about meaning and purpose. I think I think what you're writing about a lot is this human search for belonging and purpose and home, and what happens when we find it and what happens when we can't find it, where we turn to for those things. So could you talk a little bit about those ideas and the danger and the kind of goodness of wanting to belong?
Yeah, I mean, I think everything really does come down to that, terror of exile and the drive to, be a part of something greater than ourselves. And that doesn't necessarily refer, the religious drive or a religious transcendental function doesn't need to be understood as connecting to a higher power. In terms of a God conventionally understood, but rather to be a part of something that's, again, greater than ourselves, that community. And in our kind of mad rush to have that safety or perceived safety, we are always unseeing. And I think all of us kind of have this experience, whether, with our first families or our school experience or the culture, society that surrounds us, where there has been, a gap between the ideals and the patterns of behavior that is enormously threatening to a person's self-concept. And in our drive to kind of write the narrative that we're told is true, or that seems like it would offer the most security, we will unsee very damaging things. And when we play along in that way, we don't just, abandon ourselves, but we are part of something that is ultimately self-defeating. So I have a theme in the book of looking unflinchingly at the world as it is. There's nothing so scary as that which, we can't confront. And when you stand in the presence of something that's very disappointing, and it's impossible to tell yourself the same story about who you are, or who your relationships are, what your relationships are, or what the world is, that is annihilating in certain ways. And that could possibly be a very good thing, but you have to walk through the fire in order to get there. And when I was starting the book, by visiting the Mennonite families, that was November 2016. And so I have a page in the book where I describe the experience of waking up the day after election day, and getting my normal coffee, getting on the subway, going to visit the families, and everything is normal, but nothing's normal, because I'm feeling this radiant sense of shame for my surprise and my shock, and believing that things could have been otherwise when we had so much information about what the country was, how the political system worked, and we couldn't just short circuit to a more favorable outcome. I'm sorry, I'm making very assumptions about people's politics here. They're the assumptions about people who buy literary nonfiction and attend Strand events. But so that kind of unseeing, that process that I had been unseeing in the lead up to that election, was annihilating in certain ways. And I've had that experience on a personal level, and I've had that experience in relational levels. And that's where change occurs. So we can either double down and that, constrict ourselves, or we can accept the world as it is and make room for a new story. But that involves a huge amount of work, because you have to put down so many safety-seeking stories and start entirely from scratch.
That's really powerful. That idea of unseeing is really an interesting way to think about denial, or like refusal. It reminds me almost of like refrigerator blindness, when you think something looks a certain way and then you go and you can't find the thing, but it's right there. I have that all the time with people are telling me the thing and I don't want to hear what they're saying. So I literally don't hear it. But to think of, my partner, Eric, always says denial is the fifth force in the universe. Like, it's very, very powerful. I felt that even when we had, our foster daughter, and all signs were pointing like this is not going to work out, but I was committed to it. And it does bring, when you can no longer pretend, it brings a kind of shattering that is, requires a certain kind of rebuilding of the world and of yourself.
Well, I was going to say, sorry, I can't get my left and right. I'm happy to talk about this. I don't know what's left and right, but yeah. And then that news story that you literally wrote about that experience. Can you, that is would have been, and as we can, readers of Stranger Care do know, annihilated. But what happens on the other side? What life is available on the other side? Mm-hmm. And it's remarkable, not just what it can do for yourself, but for so many other people who hadn't had the strength, or someone sitting with them in the hole.
Yeah, you have that moment in the book where you're sitting by by someone's dead body, and you talk about your terror and your desire to run from the room. And I wanted to ask you about, there's you're writing about other people almost like a journalist in a very beautiful and I think very ethical and generous way, which I'd love to talk about in terms of craft. But there's these moments where you bring in your own story from your family history, that your own ghost that you experienced as a child. Like, there's these moments of really radical connection, and they show up especially when I'm like, how is she going to connect to this? Like, this is wild, she's like, how is this going to work? So I was wondering if you could talk about how you choose when to offer those connections, those kind of intimate moments, and when you hold back from that, and what you think that's doing on the page.
Right. So I'm aware that when it comes to the first person, I feel like I don't have a huge amount of choice, and that's the voice I have. It's heavily influenced by all the books that came before it, and that is what it is. And I always, aware of criticism that's a very narcissistic way. Why would you include yourself in the story? Blah, blah, blah. To which I always respond as if the most narcissistic thing isn't the passive third person, all-seeing eye of God. Because when we're writing nonfiction, it's always partial. And this is Malcolm again. It's always partial and subjective and selective. And if you can see me on the page, there's this information is being filtered through another subjective voice, and you can take it or leave it. But at least it's that. So that's the first kind of ethical contract or accord that I like to make with the reader. But there's also another contract operating, which is between me and the people that I'm interviewing. And, if I'm going to call them subjects, then I should be a subject as well of that story. I should be interrogating myself. I should be as vulnerable on the page as they have decided to make themselves. And it is, I think, not just ethical, but also a more realistic, interesting, honest way of writing. And so in terms of how I decide what to put in, that's in the edit. It's not easy for me. And to be honest, I would not, if I had another way of doing it, I probably would, because it's, I'm very private. Like when we're writing, we get to make that decision about how it's framed and how much and where and how, but it's still very exposing. And so that's just one of the discoveries of the writing that I am committed to doing, is it's going to involve that discomfort. But it took 4 years to write, and you can try out different things, see how it feels, kind of imagine it out in the world and no longer belonging to you. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? What would come of that? I mean, you can't plan for everything. How will it be understood or misunderstood? All these questions you get to sit with during the writing process. And even if something feels like it might be overexposing or bad, if it suits the story, at the end of the day, I'm well with leaving it in, and I've had that time to put it in a way I'm comfortable with. So I'm still learning all of that.
Yeah, but it creates a really good sense of shared vulnerability, because I had this sense of, I don't know what your process is with the people that you're interviewing, for whether they get to read, sometimes that's not possible.
Yes.
Like for me in Stranger Care, it was not possible to have people I write about read it. But how do you think, like, who are you holding yourself accountable to when you're writing? How do you think about that?
Well, it's a tricky thing. I mean, I think, again, it's inevitably messy, those bits, but where somebody so I never convince anybody to let me interview them. Either they're into it or they're not. I'm not going to hound them or argue or make a case for it. And so it kind of self-selects people that are willing to be more vulnerable than the average bear. And as that process continues, if the story has legs and a nice arc and we're going somewhere, then I will get a sense of what they're comfortable with, and I'll have a better sense of their life. And where a person is particularly vulnerable, I don't have a problem with allowing them to read before it goes to print. That doesn't mean that I'm going to change something that I consider to be true. And so in that sense, it can cause issues. But if they are deeply uncomfortable with something, or I got something wrong, I am very grateful to have those conversations. And I feel like if they're sharing lessons learned in a life that was very hard won, I'm not there to create additional pain. So that's one answer. The other one is where I'm interviewing someone more journalistically, the Creation Museum, for instance. I will not make that offer, and I then have to pass through my own tests of, is it accurate? Am I well with how I represented all of this on the page, both what was said and not said in the context? Am I well with telling you that was the truth as I saw it to the best of my ability? And I have a very sensitive guilt button in that regard. So that's the first one. And then, is it relevant? So, and you do your best to balance it, because hanging over everything is this obligation to the reader. You are writing nonfiction. It's factual writing. It has to do what it says on the box, which is, this is a true story. And so that's kind of the holy test over everything. But that doesn't mean that you can't do your best to the people that are contributing to the story, to make them feel heard and have agency over their own story as well.
And I like the way you say that about it's a true story, because you're also talking about the messiness of life. You're talking about like the transcendence of an individual that can't be captured on the page. So how do you show that? And just this complicated juxtaposition among characters makes it just much more vibrant and three-dimensional than it would be if you had just chosen to write like a book about UFOs or a book about death doulas or a book about Mennonites. There's something in bringing them together and then putting your story on the page as well that makes it kind of shine in a way that it couldn't otherwise. So I'm curious, I don't know if you can answer this, but what's your favorite story in the book? Like, what's your favorite person, or what surprised you, or what did you change your mind about as you were doing this research?
Well, I think Annie's story has a very special place. And I say Annie's story, but it also includes Katrina, because Annie is the death doula. She's a practicing Buddhist, and she has been for 40 years. She's now in her late 60s. She had a very traumatic life, early part of her life before she found her Buddhist practice. And she uses all of these kind of spiritual learnings and skills to help people have the most peaceful deaths possible. And I was in conversation with her for about 2 years before I got the chance to see her in her work. She doesn't refer to the people she helps as clients. They're just the people she helps. But it took 2 years before, understandably, one was willing to make the time, because they are actively at the end of their lives, to share their story with me. And that was Katrina. And I didn't understand what it took to do Annie's work until I saw her in action, because it was incredibly confronting. And I had the benefit of Katrina kind of explaining what she was undergoing in real time. And that was the dead body that you referred to earlier. That Katrina was the first dead person that I was in the room with. And it was, I think, something that can only be experienced. We kind of fit it. I can try my best to fit it into the, jacket of language, but it's something that really, when you're in the presence of it, it's terrifying and awesome in the original senses of those words. You're connected to something so outside the artificial society that we've created and, sanitized for ourselves. It's a much more raw human experience. And Annie marshaling all these forces with a lightness and a unflinching quality was, I think, I'm using it in Buber's sense, was holy to be in the presence of. So that story made an enormous impact on me. It surprised me greatly just how unnerving it was. It surprised me greatly how difficult it was to capture on the page. And that there's certain things that perhaps cannot be captured on the page, which I think is one of the lies that we tell ourselves as writers, that this is a place of security and safety and solitude in which the world can be understood. And certain things are outside that realm. So that was all, I think, necessarily surprising to me, but it was destabilizing. And I mentioned in the book that I procrastinated on that chapter for longer than I have with any other.
It's
writing.
Beautifully written. And I think your writing about the body is beautiful. Your use of dialogue is beautiful. You do that amazing thing where you generate the emotion in the reader without having to tell me, like, this is devastating. Like, I feel devastated by it, but also feel the beauty, the powerful beauty of what Annie's doing as a death doula, and the ways that turning towards the fact that we all will die. Every single one of us will die, and to figure out for your own self and for your family what a good death looks like. The tremendous healing for the person who's dying and for the people that they will leave behind. I think you really show that in a beautiful way.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. And we're about to get, I think we're getting queued for Q&A, but I want to ask you just one more question about your writing practice itself. What is your writing practice like? Is it, I know I work with a lot of writers, and the more I work with them, like, people write different. Some like write at kindergarten birthday parties with their back turned towards the gymnastics, other people have a very like sacred time. So what is yours like?
Like, I mean, ideally it would be the latter, but it's probably closer to the former. I probably can too easily understand exactly why that would be a good situation to write in, because your kid is being supervised by someone else, and now you have 3 seconds of peace. What can you do with it? So I do try, in my former life, I was a lawyer, and I still bring that very neurotic desire to account for 6-minute increments of my day and be productive and blah blah blah, and it's not possible with writing for a number of reasons. The two that are relevant for me are, one, I have very young children, and the second one is creative writing does not lend itself to that process. So the answer is I'm lucky enough now to do this as my job. I work I'm not back to full time because I do have a very young toddler. But when I have work days or work blocks, I sit down at the desk, and my guiding principle is to write something that didn't exist before I sat down. The impulse is, particularly when you're exhausted, is to edit or to research. But if I can even write one sentence or a phrase that didn't exist before that day, I feel that's what progress looks like. It doesn't need to be volume, but it does need to be kind of consistent. So that's something that guides me. Again, Virginia Woolf, the door closes, that's good. You're at a desk and or a slab of MDF from IKEA, and you're just focusing, generating something new. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I'm a mom, and it's a bit of a keeling ship, but we're writing all the time because the subconscious is marinating, and we think, oh, I wish I had more time to read more articles or more journals or more books, and I want to have to sit down and make my notes. But everything that you've read is churning in there. And if you go for a walk and you do it lighter, not harder, you will, in the shower or, making a sandwich, make a connection that might be everything. So we do need to make time to go more gently with ourselves, because if you're working on a project and you have something in mind, it's always bubbling away. So that's the Messiness.
That's perfect. I love that idea of writing something new every day. It reminds me of something Carolyn Forche, the poet and memoirist, said to me, which is, don't revise, don't go back, go forward.
Absolutely. So
I think it's much easier to revise and tinker, and but there's a huge freedom in just generating, which I think you're talking about there. So it's
yes.
All right. Are you ready for some questions?
I'm ready.
So Esther is asking, how did you discover the origin of these stories?
Well, so again, I wish I had a lawyerly answer for that involved a replicable process. But it is much more serendipitous. It is about, with those Mennonites, just seeing in the subway this very optically bizarre situation of 50 white people singing and nobody looking at them, and the words seem offensive to me, but the sound is so beautiful, and I haven't moved for 2 seconds because I can't take my eyes off them. So that's kind of an example of how it normally works. And the analogy is, when and it has been 1,000 years since I did this, but I used to skateboard. And when you are skateboarding, the whole world, you're looking with different eyes at the world, because that's a fun ramp, or that's a fun rail, or whatever. So suddenly the world is transformed. When you're a writer, the whole world becomes interesting and potentially a source of story. And there are more stories than there are people. So, it's about how you look at the world, what you're feeling or thinking on a certain day. And that might be just enough of a grain that you then pursue what might be there. But the other answer to that is that you got to, what does it go through? A lot of milk to get the cream. So a lot of things that I hope might be stories or think or fairly confident are stories aren't. So it's a process.
Yeah, I love that idea of as like a skater, it transforming the whole world, how you see the world. That's a really great analogy. So Patrick is asking if you wrote this book primarily during the pandemic, what was it like to flesh out these stories during an isolating time?
Oh gosh, that's a lovely question. So, I'm like a squirrel getting my acorns, and I had been doing that since 2016. And lo and behold, it's 2020 and I'm pulling everything together and the world is changing, on a second to second basis. So it definitely informed my thinking at that, latest stage when you're so familiar with the material that you're thinking at the micro level and the macro level, and you're knitting everything together and calling forward and calling backward. That stage of writing and final drafting. It was like a life raft for me to have this at that time, because I couldn't have anticipated that the pandemic was going to happen, but it was showing in real time the application of these tendencies that we have to unsee and to see and to take these chances for connection and just blow them up into opportunities for division. And I envisage what a different way of managing or not politicizing, public health issue might look like, what we might do with our own vulnerability. And also just having the certainty and the safety and the solitude of sitting with a manuscript that had become very familiar to you by that point. So, I mean, in certain ways, it was a really positive opportunity, and in other ways, just devastating, because what certainties could see us through such an unprecedented experience for us. So a mixed bag, but perhaps very fertile for that reason.
Haley said she loves that you mentioned, Haley loves that you mentioned Breanne Brown. Is there a title of hers that you would recommend?
I still think The Gifts of Imperfection is one of her finest articulated version of this research that she had done into an area that before she started looking at shame, it was like one of those things that when you see it, but you couldn't really give a definition of it. And then once you start looking at it in your own life, you see, you're florid with it. And The Gifts of Imperfection, I remember looking at the title and thinking, oh, that's interesting, but being very surprised about what that book held. And it formed the basis for, what's now the most watched TED Talk, or one of the most watched TED Talks. And her subsequent work is also very illuminating, but I always come back to that first book.
Beautiful. And I see there's a question in the Q&A. I won't forget. I mean, it's in the chat. I won't forget that one. I'll come back to that, but I'm going through Q&A now. So Leanne would like to know if you would like you to talk about the structure and flow of the stories. How did you choose the order? And I might not have made it clear that it's braided, but you can talk about that.
Yeah, so I do choose the order very much. That is a conscious process. But before that can happen, my Australian editor, Mandy Brett, describes it as just seeing ahead in what you can see in the headlights. So you can't take on the responsibility at that writing stage for the fully formed product. You can only look ahead to the material in front of you, and how it connects to other things in the research. And so you're very much following, it's an intuitive process at first, and then it gets refined, in subsequent drafts into something that's clearer. But that intuitive understanding of this calls back to what I heard someone else say, and I'm going to put that here. That's a very intuitive process at first. And
it works really well, and kind of like an argument by placement that I think is really interesting.
Exactly.
Henrietta would like to know, were you able to decompress after writing this book, and what resources would you recommend for decompressing?
Henrietta, I'm the wrong person to speak to about decompressing. But when you find out, please let me know. When I say that the work was a life raft, I'm probably referring more generally to the fact that productivity is a bit of a trauma response for me. And so decompression is exactly what's needed. And I need to take some of my own advice and go gently and not, fling myself so much at the work. Having kids is a good self-regulation because you just can't. But in all seriousness, reading is always how I kind of fill up again. And I'm lucky enough that it's a part of the work that I do, but never feels like work. And just time with my family and my friends and my community is, away from the desk, not thinking how anything could be used or what it relates to, but just actually being in the moment, which kids make very easy and community makes very easy. And unfortunately, the times around us make very easy. So yeah, that kind of call back to life.
Beautiful. I mean, and you talk in the book a lot about breath work, about breathing. I felt that throughout the pages of the book, as well, the importance of breath. Okay, this is an anonymous attendee. What concepts are you grappling with at the moment that might become future projects for you? That's a beautiful question.
That's really lovely. I would like to write something that has a more readily metabolized, a darkness that is more quickly understood in terms of beauty. So the short answer to that is I've been thinking for a while about, I don't like to talk, this is funny because I feel like if I talk about something before I know what it is, it hardens in concrete and then I never get to develop it further. But I'll tell you, like, it concerns a meteorite that fell many decades ago and what we might understood about the people that experienced that. So I think, no murder, no blood, and it comes from the dark, and what can we do with that in a more positive way? I feel I owe readers that by this point.
That's beautiful. I always am like, oh, this next book will be my happy book. Nope. Nope. Okay, here's a from Judith in the chat. Judith writes, in Trauma Cleaner, I loved your use of personal anecdotes. I'm shocked that for some that's a source of criticism. How does your background and knowledge in the criminal, and then it skips, how does your experience and deep knowledge of the criminal justice system impact the storytelling in The Believer?
Oh, wow, that's a great question. So I always try to apply not the legal understanding of evidence, because the law has its own lies and fictions that serve it in its search for black and white truth. So its rules of evidence aren't what they seem to be. But what I did get from too many years spent studying criminal law is a very strong respect for context and an understanding from very empirical, data-driven, jury-based research that humanizing context and people's punitive tendencies are in a inverse relationship. And so if I can understand as much about the world and the people that I'm talking to and myself, and I can put all of that context in together, then all of these shaming and blaming narratives that, I, as much as anyone, will be driven into, suddenly don't look so appealing. We don't need them anymore. We have a humanizing understanding. And so, the law gets a lot of crap, and I am involved in that myself for, sticking things into boxes that don't reflect reality. But what it is always striving to do, and what it can always be improved and reformed to do better, is this concern with context to understand action and culpability. And that is something that I've carried in anything I write. Yeah.
Oh, that's a profound answer. That's beautiful. Thank you for that question, Judith. Are there any closing remarks you'd like to make?
Well, I would like to thank you. The fact that I can be here talking with you at Strand is unbelievable to me. Talk about Believer. Sarah's books, particularly Stranger Care and Draw Your Weapons were remarkably anchoring for me in reconceiving the way that story can be used at the service of something larger and more connecting. And so my closing remarks is just, I'm very emotional. I'm so grateful to you for who you are and what you've put out in the world, Sarah.
Oh, thank you. And there's one more question I've just been given. But thank you for those kind words. And I want to hold up your beautiful book because everyone should buy it. It's gorgeous. I've read it twice. You only have to read it once, but it's amazing and it will change how you look at the world. But there's a question of, would you ever write fiction? And is the prospect of doing so a cheer or a fear from Israel?
Cheer or fear. Oh, there you go. So I have written fiction. I have not shown anybody the fiction. It took me 20 years to show somebody the nonfiction. I don't know if I've got another 20 years left at this point because I'm 5,000 years old. But hopefully one day I will summon up the courage to do that. The short answer is yes, I would very much like to do that.
Oh, that's beautiful. Well, thank you everybody for being here. Thank you to the Strand. Thank you to Sarah. It's one of my greatest gifts that writing has led me to know you and your beautiful work. And I hope everyone will buy this to support Sarah and to support the Strand. And, these are the stories that will help get us through.
Thank you.
Thank you for Sarah Krasnostein and Sarah Sentilles for being here for such an insightful conversation. If you haven't done so, I have the link for the book on the chat on the right. It would also come with a signed book point if you like that as well. And thank you for everyone for attending and have a good night.
Thank you.